Welcome back to Illinois Lawmakers Weekly coverage of the spring session of the Illinois General Assembly. I'm Jak Tichenor, here for a reporters' roundtable about the recently completed spring session. Our Capital News Illinois editor-in-chief, Jerry Nowicki, and Statehouse reporters Peter Hancock and Ben Szalinski. Good to have everybody back. Let's start with each of you by getting your overall impressions of the spring session. What do you want folks at home to know about what you think were the highlights of what happened, what got done, and perhaps, maybe even more importantly, what didn't get done? Peter, let's start with you, okay?
I thought overall it was a very lean session. There wasn't a lot of money to go around, so the budget was very tight. And as a result, you didn't see a whole lot of bold new initiatives that we've seen in the early years of the Pritzker administration. Outside of the budget, there was what you might call small ball. Lawmakers putting out sort of a scattershot collection of small policy initiatives, maybe, not headline making in and of their own right, but certainly important to the people who are directly affected by them. In the meantime, a lot of major issues, which I'm sure we'll talk about, got left on the table: pension reform, transit reform in the Chicago metro area, things like that.
Jerry, what's your view, your overview of the spring session? As Peter was saying, a lot of things kind of held back from the starting gate or the finish line, if you will.
Yeah, I think it was interesting that, from a taxpayer's perspective, it's looking like certain business taxes, and then nicotine users and sports bettors are the main people who will see changes in, the taxes they're facing. But there is still room with some of these measures that failed, specifically transit reform that carried with it a $1.50 per package delivery fee. And then, energy policy, which could create more tax credits for energy storage and things like that. Those are measures that didn't pass, but lawmakers still might come back to consider at some point between now and the fall that, would have more direct impacts on more Illinoisans as to, what's coming from their pocketbook to fund some of these state initiatives. So that's what we're continuing to watch there.
Ben, from your perspective, what are the big takeaways for you from your perspective? You're on the ground there, just like the other folks. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, in addition to the delays and what didn't get done, I think just how long it took to actually get to the big items that we didn't see the budget introduced until 24 hours before it was passed. We didn't see the taxes that were part of that budget plan introduced until 6 hours before they were passed. We didn't see the transit reform introduced until 3 days before. So all these big items, lawmakers just left to the last second. I think that partially contributed to what didn't get done. And on pensions, for example, we saw a reform that was filed a few days before the end of session, but the governor's office said, we don't have enough time to review this proposal. So, that I think just contributed to the lack of reform getting done there.
Yeah, one of the reports I said I saw said, well, we can't really react to bullet points. We need a lot more detail on this, and something like a pension reform bill of that magnitude probably does need a lot more, if you will, meticulous detail.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's, all these items were just so big in that, lawmakers had days and days that they had to go through this for the last several months, but then they put it off to the final couple hours. And some of these bills are several thousand pages long for the budget, for example. So I think it's hard for lawmakers to pass big, meaningful reforms like that when they just aren't sure exactly what's the reform actually going to accomplish.
Well, it's interesting. In my time around the State House and yours, I'm sure, we've watched some of these issues go from one year to the next and to the next. And to have, well, let's say, Tier 2 pension reform, transit reform, all of these things to try to knock it out in one session for one of them would be big enough to begin with, much less trying to cover all this ground in what basically amounts to when you think of all the vacation days and breaks and things like that, well, it's about a 5-month window.
Yeah, and we saw energy reform also left to the last minute too. And some folks have told CNI that this would be a monumental reform on the scale of CEJA, for example. So, these are all earth-shattering things that would certainly transform the state of Illinois in the future. So, I think it's lawmakers had a lot on their plate, and leaving everything to the last second just it made it hard to accomplish any of these.
We've gone into some detail over the last couple of months as the budget started to take shape and all, but let's kind of review for a moment. Let's go back to February when Governor Pritzker laid out his plan for a $55.2 billion spending plan for the coming fiscal year. As you look at the budget that eventually passed in the last hours of the General Assembly, gentlemen, how closely does that resemble what the governor put out there, and how did the playing field change over the intervening months until we got into the last day or two of sessions? This is one for everyone to jump in on.
So I'd say it looks pretty close to what the governor had. I think one of the big differences was that while they agreed to spend pretty much the exact same amount, that they by the time we got to May, they anticipated $500 million less in base revenues, which was led to some of the fund sweeps or pausing, moving money to the road fund that just needed to make up a little bit extra money to fund sort of the baseline expenditures that the governor had proposed.
Jerry, I'm going to get back to that in a minute. Peter, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it was fairly close. There were some differences. One of the big ones in my mind was in K through 12 education. I think the governor had proposed the full $350 million that is called for in the evidence-based funding formula, but did not necessarily call for full funding of this other category of spending in K-12, which is called mandatory categorical spending, which is largely transportation costs and a few other things in there. What passed was just $307 million. It did not include the $50 million that usually goes in for property tax relief. And also, it did not include the categorical aid, and some education advocates are concerned that without the full funding of the categorical aid, that it really diminishes the effectiveness of the evidence-based funding, which is by law programmed into specific areas. So yeah, the legislature did have to get a little more conservative there toward the end, as Jerry was saying, because of the revised revenue estimates. And, some things like that happened. But overall, I think, the broad strokes were pretty close to what the governor had proposed.
Ben, you've been studying the budget proposal from the mid-February on down to now. Your thoughts?
I think my biggest takeaway there is that lawmakers warmed up to spending reductions or spending freezes, and that they realized there just isn't room for major new programs in this year's budget. I feel like after the governor introduced his budget in February, there was a lot of pushback that maybe he wasn't investing enough in certain areas. He should have done more on education. The immigrant healthcare program should stay. Ultimately, lawmakers really went in line with what he proposed by doing what Peter said there, freezing out some of the spending increases on education, not including the immigrant healthcare program for certain adults. And I think they just kind of recognize that the economy is changing so much and that spending freezes are necessary.
Jerry, I want to go back to the point you made about fund sweeps and things like that. How many one-time revenue measures are included in this budget in terms of making sure everything kind of meets the bottom line? Everything's paid for, but what are the things that they did in terms of transfers, sweeping funds that still had excess funds in them, and what are the implications for trying to pass next year's budget? Because, as we say, these are one-time revenue measures.
Yeah, so I think we tried to do the math in the office. It's not always the easiest thing to do, but somewhere along the lines of 300 to $500 million, I think would be pretty close on the fund sweeps and various one-time tricks. And so it in and of itself is an issue if you expect baseline revenues and federal reimbursements to remain steady. But there is absolutely no guarantee that that happens. You know, this reconciliation, big beautiful bill, as Trump calls it, in Congress could really drastically alter that far beyond, you know, just one-time revenues going away and needing more accounting tricks for next year. So that it's all foreshadowing an even more challenging year next year, really.
I think you make a good point. This is probably in Springfield parlance what we used to call well, in my case, decades past, a maintenance budget. Get it over the finish line and we'll see where things go. But as you were saying, Jerry, there's this whole thing of what President Trump wants to have a bill signed at the federal level as far as the new budget goes and all of the things that he wants in it by July 4th. So there are all these things that we don't know. Now, Republicans have told us in recent weeks that, well, remember, there's still budget reconciliation. There's all of this. Whatever the House passed doesn't necessarily mean that's what the Senate, or when it goes back to the House for reconciliation, doesn't mean that that's exactly what's going to be in there. But so many unknowns.
Yeah, unknowns and just sort of extended timelines. So the effects of it would happen over a period of years. That's still to be decided as to how many years. But long story short, there's probably going to be a little bit of budget cut, sort of whack-a-mole over the next 2-3 years and beyond, if something like that, as broad as it is now, passes through Congress.
Ben, Peter, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think Jerry's exactly right there in that, lawmakers really budgeted for the short term. This was a budget for this year. And I think we've heard a lot of Democrat leaders say the same thing, that this was not a great budget, but it's the budget we needed at this time. But I think that will lend the question next year and in future years to, well, was this also a responsible budget, one that, is actually continuing to set us up for fiscal success in future years and not just creating more challenges by taking money out of these funds that aren't necessarily going to be replaceable as general revenue that the state depends on every single year.
Peter?
Yeah, I think there are two big question marks out there regarding the big, beautiful bill that Jerry was describing. What happens to federal spending on Medicaid, which is a huge portion of the overall state budget, and what happens to federal funding on higher education, specifically academic research, student loans, other kinds of student financial aid. I think they were largely playing defense, just trying, preparing themselves for the possibility that the landscape could change dramatically in the next 2, 3, 5 years.
And as you look at the overall budget, when you look at the potential impacts on Medicaid and other forms of spending like that, no state among the 50 could be expected to make up for the amount that could possibly be taken away for it, at least at this point, when it comes to the bill that the House passed a couple of weeks ago. Anyone?
Yeah, I certainly, if our viewers of this show have certainly heard Don Harmon, Speaker Welch make that point, the governor said it over and over again. It'd be some pretty drastic either cuts to people's care that they're receiving in Illinois or just straight up need for new taxes.
Exactly. The other things that we were kind of hinting at the beginning of the program, things that didn't go through that will be around for a long time. Transit reform passed the Senate, but not the House. Why didn't it get into the end zone before the session ended? There was this idea, there were revenues attached to that, putting a $1.50 fee on deliveries around the state. If I'm reading the information correctly, 80% of that would have gone to the Chicago area mass transit systems. Downstate would have got the remaining 20%. Why didn't it get through the House, gentlemen?
I think there's a lot of reasons, but the main reason that I have heard from lawmakers is that the House wasn't ready to take up the revenue proposals. They had not discussed it in these caucus meetings, and these are tough votes. This isn't just saving public transit. This is taking a vote on tax increases that are going to affect your constituents. And, we know that a lot of people just aren't thrilled when lawmakers increase their taxes for any reason. So it really seemed to me that the House just didn't have an opportunity to review what these tax options were. They gave their input in a lot of ways, but they just weren't ready to move forward on it. This was really a standalone Senate proposal where the Senate had revenue options, they had reforms to go with it, and the House just, I don't know if you could want to call it a step behind, but that seems to be where they were, that they wanted to tackle reform separately of revenue.
Jerry, Peter?
I think one of the unanswered questions, and I think analysts can sit back and debate this for the next several years, was it a strategic decision to put those policy decisions off to another time, or was it a failure in leadership? Were they just not able to pull together the coalitions needed to put those things over the finish line? As Ben was just saying, these are tough decisions. Some of them are going to be unpopular, and the increased taxes and fees that they were talking about are not going to get any more popular over the next 6 to 8 months or however long it takes. The decisions aren't going to get any easier. So I think you're left wondering, when is the right time to address this, and is the current leadership prepared to do what it takes to amass the votes and pull people together and get them all moving in the same direction?
Peter makes a good point, and Jerry, I'm thinking, let's take a look at the timelines here. The federal COVID money that has sustained these mass transit agencies in the Chicagoland area will expire later this year. When do the transit agencies start putting together their budgets, and without the guarantee of the new revenues at this point heading into their next fiscal year, where does that leave them? Are we going to be hearing in coming weeks and months these doomsday scenarios from CTA, Metra, RTA, PACE, et cetera?
Yeah, we'll continue to hear things like that. But when it comes down to it, November is kind of the deadline. Ben's done some thorough reporting on that they're got to prove their budgets by then. So you're looking at probably something in October. They really need to act to avoid some of the layoffs they're talking about.
And Ben, as Jerry said, you've been working extensively in this area. So what happens in October? Well, that's the veto session. So looks like they're going to be teeing up something, or at least there will be public pressure to tee up something as they go into October.
Yeah, and the key is really going to be getting lawmakers, Democrats specifically, on the same page. It requires a 3/5 vote to pass the General Assembly in October. And the version that passed the Senate did not have that amount of votes on it yet. So lawmakers really, I think, are going to have to go back to the drawing board to find out exactly what is the best path forward to actually get enough votes to pass this before the end of October. And so these transit agencies can pass their budgets in November, knowing that there is going to be state money to avoid a fiscal cliff starting in January.
I'm glad you made that point, because going into anything after May 31st, you're looking at having to have a supermajority in both houses, 71 in the House, 36 in the Senate. And if they were having that much trouble cobbling together the votes for the Senate version with Democrats alone, it vastly increases the problems for them. Let's move on to an issue that you've all of you raised earlier, and that has to do with the omnibus energy bill. Electrical payers in the state are going to be seeing increases this summer because of a variety of factors. This bill was supposed to be the successor to CEJA. What happened? Why didn't it get off the ground and into the air? Anyone want to take a poke at that first?
Yeah, anytime you talk about energy, there's far more factors going into it than can be discussed, even if we dedicated this whole program to it. But really get down to it, there's the rates are going to go up this summer because of the capacity auctions, just sort of the promise that the uh, the multi-state grids kind of just buy energy into the future just to make sure it's on the line. And to simplify it, that auction for that in both the downstate and Northern Illinois region, just energy was way more expensive than people had expected. A number of contributing factors like fossil fuels going offline, but that really caused lawmakers to take stock and say, "Oh, what do we do next?" But one of the components of this energy bill would have been tax credits for battery storage for like wind and solar farms. So you're looking at adding more to customer bills if you pass this, and add that to the other challenges of getting unions to agree and energy companies, and you're just biting off more than you can chew in the last week of session.
Peter, Ben?
Yeah, as Jerry kind of alluded to there, it seemed like one of the biggest challenges was actually just getting broad support for this legislation. There was an initial proposal that would have imposed more costs on businesses for energy, that would have required businesses to shoulder more of the burden for their own energy costs. And, that was really just a non-starter for a lot of these groups, such as the labor unions. And so, it was just like a lot of other issues, I think, in this General Assembly, in that it took a long time to get to an agreement. And once the framework finally came out, people were still opposed, and those differences needed to be ironed out before any bill could pass.
Peter?
Yeah, I think one of the things this is going to do is cause people maybe to go back and relook at the way Illinois procures energy during those peak demand periods when we have to buy energy off of the auction markets. And it maybe will put more pressure on policymakers and on utility providers here in Illinois to start increasing the state's own generating capacity and to do so outside of the fossil fuel industry.
One thing I want to get to before we wind up things, this was supposed to be the year that lawmakers would decide how to close the gap between Tier 1 and Tier 2 state employees when it comes to their pension benefits. Short explanation, employees hired since 2011 have to work longer and they get less than Tier 1 employees in retirement. It sets up a conflict with the Social Security system. Ben, you just wrote an extensive story on that. What happens if the state doesn't get this handled in the next few months, perhaps a year? What happens to the state? Are we on the hook for a lot of money that we don't have based on what we've all been talking about with the budget constraints of the state?
Yeah, the problem that we've started to recognize over the last few years is that there are a handful of state employees and non-state employees, police officers, teachers as well, who don't meet the federal Social Security safe harbor requirement that requires that pension benefits must be equal to Social Security benefits. And this is really an issue for not everybody who earns a Tier 2 pension, but for certain people. And as we see more people in Tier 2 begin to retire, this is going to be a growing issue where their pensions are out of compliance with federal law, and the difference is going to have to be made up. And that's where, if there is a difference to be made up, there's going to be major costs to the employer for those people. That could be the school district, it could be a local police department, it could be the entire state. And so lawmakers are trying to get a handle on this and figure out what's the best way to address this issue. So we're not entirely sure what's going to happen, how much it's going to cost to fix this issue, but at some point, we do expect that lawmakers are probably going to pass legislation that would create some sort of parity, at least as far as total benefits go for people on the higher earning scale between Tier 2 and what Social Security would offer.
And as you said, we don't exactly know how much we're talking about. I've heard some figures batted about as it plays out between now and 2045 thereabouts. Is there a deadline by which we have to be compliant with the federal government and they step in and say, all right, guys, it's time to pay up?
It's possible the deadline has already passed. There are people on tier two who have retired and don't meet that Social Security requirement. But I think it really is whenever the court decides to step in, if maybe one of these retirees wants to sue the state for offering inadequate benefits, the court could step in and say, hey, you need to offer benefits that are equal to Social Security. So that I think is really the challenge here is lawmakers don't know when their deadline is. All they know is the problem is going to continue to grow if it's not addressed.
Any thoughts on your parts, Jerry and Peter?
I think it's kind of interesting. This is one of those things that actually dates back to the 1930s when they first created Social Security. The federal government did not require state and local governments to take part in it because that was considered at the time to be the federal government taxing states. And as a result, people thought that was unconstitutional. So they put in a requirement that said you don't have to participate in Social Security, but if you don't, you have to provide something that is at least as generous as Social Security. And that's a very difficult thing to calculate, actually.
As we kind of come to the end of this program, so we've set the stage for what could be a very active veto session. There is also the possibility that depending on what happens on Capitol Hill in the next couple of months, lawmakers may be back at the Capitol before veto session. Gentlemen, what are your thoughts as to what the future looks like here as far as we know about what's happening at the Statehouse? Jerry, I'll start with you in the last couple of minutes we have.
Yeah, I think if I could give you a good answer to that, I'd probably get a raise and be in state government. But no, I think it's just it'll just be constantly reacting to the news out of Washington and whatever else, whatever fiscal challenges present themselves.
Ben?
Yeah, I think you'll see a lot of crises pop up as far as Washington, public transit. There's going to be a lot of talk about returning. I don't know that lawmakers are actually going to return this summer. I think they're going to take some time to digest these issues coming out of Washington and move on from there.
Yeah, and you make a good point about that, Ben, I've seen this happen years now, that there's a lot of talk about coming back, but to actually round up, Peter, a special session is not the easiest thing in the world to do, even in Springfield.
Yeah, it's not, especially when people have vacation plans. People have, these are lawmakers, many of whom have outside careers of their own outside the State House. It's very difficult to pull a special session together. They've got the veto session coming up in October. That's early enough that they should be able to address a lot of the issues still hanging over their heads.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Jerry. Whatever happens in the next few months, Capital News Illinois will be there for you to give you all the latest from the Illinois State Capitol. Thanks so much for joining us for this edition of Illinois Lawmakers.